I never thought I'd be standing in a ballroom in a $12,000 gown, next to a man I barely knew 8 months ago, telling 200 strangers I would love him forever. But there I was. And the strangest part, the part that still gets me when I think about it, is that I meant every single word. Let me take you back to the beginning, because nothing about this was supposed to happen. And if you'd told me 12 months ago that this would be my life, I would have laughed in your face, called you a liar, and gone back to minding my business. But here we are, so let me tell you the truth. My name is Simone. I grew up in Atlanta's southeast side, not the part they put in the movies. We weren't poor, but we weren't comfortable either. My mother worked double shifts at a hospital for most of my childhood. She was a nurse's aide, and she was proud of that. She never complained, not once, not where I could hear her. She just worked. And she loved me in that quiet, fierce way that women like her love, through sacrifice, through showing up, through making sure I had options she never had. She raised me to stand on my own 2 feet. She raised me to not need anyone's money, anyone's last name, anyone's approval. And I took that to heart. By the time I was 31, I had my own interior design firm, small, but mine. My name was on the door. I had a 1-bedroom apartment in Midtown that I decorated myself, obviously, and I had a life I was genuinely proud of. I had also been hurt. One serious relationship, lasted 4 years, ended in a way that made me question my own judgment for a long time afterward. He wasn't a bad man. He was just someone who wanted a version of me that didn't exist, softer, less opinionated, more willing to shrink, and I spent too long trying to become her. Trying to sand down my edges so he'd feel more comfortable, laughing less loudly, having fewer thoughts out loud, making myself a smaller target. When it ended, I sat in my apartment for a weekend and cried, and then on Monday I woke up and I went back to work, and I made a decision. I was going to stop giving pieces of myself away to people who hadn't earned them. I was going to stop auditioning for roles in other people's lives. I was going to be exactly who I was, take up exactly the space I deserved, and if someone didn't like it, they could find the door themselves. I wasn't bitter. I want to be clear about that. Bitterness would have been easier, honestly, clean and sharp and simple. What I was careful, deliberate. I had walls, yes, but I had built them with my own hands from my own materials, and I trusted every brick. And I specifically, deliberately did not trust wealthy men. I had worked enough high-end design contracts to know what money does to people. It either reveals who they already were, or it changes them into something harder to reach. Either way, the result was the same: men who looked through you, past you, around you. Men who saw everything as a transaction. Men who confused ownership with love. I had made up my mind about that world a long time ago. And then Carter Whitfield walked into my life and made me question every conclusion I had ever come to. The contract came through my firm on a Tuesday. A full penthouse redesign in Boston, top floor, Back Bay neighborhood, unlimited budget. My business partner nearly fell out of her chair. For a firm our size, this was the kind of contract that changes your trajectory. You don't say no to something like that. You don't even hesitate. So I flew to Boston on a Thursday morning and walked into a building that smelled like money. You know that smell, clean and cold and deliberate. I took the elevator to the top floor and I introduced myself to Carter Whitfield. He was not what I expected. I had built a picture in my mind, old, red-faced, impatient, the kind of man who talks over you before you finish your sentence. Carter was none of those things. He was in his late 30s, quiet in a way that felt practiced, and he looked at me the way someone looks at a spreadsheet, not unkindly, just analytically. He shook my hand, said my name correctly on the first try, which I noticed, and then handed me a binder. A binder. 3 inches thick, full of specifications, preferred materials, brand references, color codes. He had done his homework, I'll give him that. He walked me through the space with the efficiency of someone presenting a quarterly report. This is the living area. This is what I need functionally. This is the timeline. Any questions? I had about 40 questions. I asked 3. The apartment was stunning in terms of architecture, floor-to-ceiling windows, incredible light, beautiful bones. But it was empty in a way that went beyond furniture. There were no photographs anywhere. No color, no softness. Nothing that said a human being lived there and loved it. It looked like a place you slept, not a place you lived. I noticed that immediately. I noticed those things. At one point, I moved a vase from a side table, just repositioning it to see how the light hit from a different angle, and Carter stopped talking mid-sentence. He watched me do it. And then he said, quietly, "Leave it there." Not rudely, just certain. I looked at him, he looked at me. "The light's better here," I said, because it was. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Fine." That was our first real conversation. Thrilling stuff. I flew home that evening telling myself that this was a job. A very good, very well-paying job. Carter Whitfield was a client. A cold, efficient, emotionally unavailable client who lived alone in a beautiful, empty apartment and apparently had feelings about vase placement. That was all. That was the whole story. I almost believed it. I spent the next 6 weeks flying back and forth between Atlanta and Boston. The work was genuinely exciting. The space had so much potential, and I was doing some of the best work of my career. But the strange thing was Carter. He kept showing up. Not in an intrusive way. He worked from home several days a week, and at first he stayed in his office while I worked. But gradually, so gradually I barely noticed it happening, he started coming out. Getting coffee. Standing near the windows while I measured. Asking questions that weren't entirely about the design. One evening I was working late, finishing some detail work on the entryway, and he came out of his office and asked if I wanted coffee. Just like that. Stood there in his perfectly pressed shirt like it was a completely normal thing to offer, like he hadn't spent the past 3 weeks treating me like a very well-reviewed vendor. I said yes, mostly out of surprise. He made it wrong, too strong, no sugar, though I'd asked for one, and he handed it to me and leaned against the counter and said, "What made you get into design?" And I told him, I don't know why. I talked about my mother, about how growing up our apartment was small, but she always made it feel intentional. A certain candle, a plant in the window, a tablecloth on Sundays. I talked about how I understood early that spaces tell you something about the people in them, that a home is a kind of autobiography. He listened. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't redirect to himself. He just listened. And then he said, "This apartment doesn't tell you anything about me, does it?" It wasn't really a question. I could have been polite. I could have said something vague and professional. Instead, I said, "No, it doesn't, not yet." He nodded slowly, like I had confirmed something he already suspected. And then he went back to his office, and I stood there in his half-finished entryway thinking, who is this man, actually? I started noticing things. The way he moved through his own space like a guest in it, always slightly formal, never fully at ease, like he was still figuring out whether he had permission to relax. The phone call I accidentally overheard one afternoon. His mother, I gathered, calling to remind him of some family obligation, a charity dinner or a board meeting, and his voice on the phone was so careful, so measured. He spoke to her the way he spoke to his accountant. Polite and perfectly managed, and completely unrevealing. I thought about what it must feel like to speak to your own mother and not let her in. I thought about my mother, who calls me baby even when I'm 31 years old, even when I'm short with her on the phone, even when I haven't called in 2 weeks, and she has every right to be annoyed. She has never once spoken to me like I was an obligation. She has only ever spoken to me like I was the most important thing in her day. Carter had grown up in a house full of people and been alone the entire time. I could see it so clearly it almost hurt to look at. I felt something shift in me. Not attraction, not yet. Something more like recognition. Something like understanding a language you didn't know you spoke. The loneliness in that apartment wasn't accidental or careless. It was an autobiography. He had built a space that told you exactly nothing about the person inside it, which told you everything. The project was nearly finished when I made my decision. I packed up my things professionally, sent the final invoice, wrote a polite completion email, and I went home to Atlanta. And I told myself that was the right thing to do. That I had done my job well, that I had earned the contract and the money and the professional win, and that whatever I thought I'd seen in Carter Whitfield was a story I had written by myself, for myself, and it didn't mean anything real. My best friend Kezia sat across from me at dinner 3 days later and watched me pick at my food and said, "Simone, what is happening with you?" I told her everything. The coffee, the conversations, the way he listened, the way he looked at the apartment after I repositioned that vase and said nothing for a full 10 seconds. She put down her fork. A white millionaire from Boston. That's not the point. I'm not saying it's the point, I'm just, Simone, I love you. But do you hear yourself? I heard myself. That was the problem. I heard myself and I didn't trust what I was saying. Because it sounded too close to something I'd promised myself I'd never do, let someone in without being sure. Let my guard down for a man from a world that had never made space for women like me. My mother was quieter when I told her. She asked one question, "Did he treat you well?" I thought about it honestly. "Yes," I said, "he did." She made a sound that wasn't quite approval and wasn't quite warning, just acknowledgement. She was giving me space to figure it out myself. That's her way. But I had already decided. I was protecting myself, and I was going home. A month passed. I was busy, new contracts, new clients, the ordinary rhythm of my life clicking back into place. I told myself I felt fine. I almost convinced myself. And then I ran into Carter at a design industry event in Atlanta. A mutual client had invited us both, neither of us knowing the other would be there. I saw him across the room before he saw me. He looked out of place, but not uncomfortably so, just quietly present, the way he always was. And then he looked up and found me, and something crossed his face that I hadn't expected. Relief. He walked over. We did the awkward professional greeting. He asked about the firm. I asked about the penthouse. And then the small talk dried up and we just stood there, and he said, without any preamble, without building up to it, "I don't know what I did wrong, but I've been going over it and I can't figure it out, and I miss talking to you." Just like that. No strategy. No performance. Carter Whitfield, who treated emotions like line items in a budget, standing in the middle of a design gala in Atlanta telling me he missed talking to me like it was simply the truth, and he didn't know how else to say it. I didn't have an answer that night. I told him I needed to think. He nodded and didn't push and gave me his number again, even though I already had it, and went back across the room. And I spent the rest of that evening not remembering a single conversation I had with anyone else. 2 weeks later, he showed up to my firm's small gallery opening. We showcased completed projects once a year. It was a modest event, not glamorous, not the world he moved in. He came alone. No assistant, no business card in hand, no agenda I could identify. He just came. He had looked up one of my early projects, a community center renovation I did for almost nothing years ago, back when I was just starting out. He mentioned it specifically. Said he'd read about it, that he thought it was the best thing in my portfolio, that it showed him something about who I was before I had anything to prove. I stood there looking at this man and felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a very long time. Not butterflies, not infatuation, something quieter and more serious than that. Something that felt like, "Oh, there you are." He told me he'd started therapy. He said it without embarrassment, without framing it as a confession. He said, "I didn't realize how much I'd closed off until you made it obvious. My therapist says I owe you a thank you. I think I owe you more than that." We left the opening together and just walked. Through Midtown, no destination, for 2 hours. He talked about growing up in Boston, about the weight of a family name and what it costs you to carry it, about choosing private equity because it was expected and spending years wondering what he would have chosen if no one had been watching. I talked about my mother, again, about Atlanta, about the first time I walked into a client's home and knew within 60 seconds what it needed, and what that feeling was like, that certainty, that clarity, and how it was the only time in my life I had ever felt undeniably, completely like myself. He said, "I've never felt that about anything." I said, "You will." I don't know why I said it, but I believed it when I said it, and I think he believed it too. We laughed at things that weren't even that funny. We disagreed about something I can't even remember now, architecture, I think. Some building he admired that I found cold, and neither of us backed down, and neither of us was angry about it. We just disagreed like two people who were secure enough not to need the other one to be wrong. And somewhere in the middle of that long walk, I stopped holding my breath. I stopped waiting for the thing that would make this make sense. I stopped looking for the catch, the fine print, the version of Carter that would eventually show up and confirm everything I had told myself about men like him. He already made sense. That was the thing, he just made sense. What followed was not a fairy tale. I want to be honest about that. We were different in almost every way you can name: background, culture, family, money, the way we moved through the world. There were moments that were genuinely hard. His family had opinions. Mine had questions. The world outside had commentary it didn't keep to itself. There were dinners where I felt every eye in the room land on us and do the calculation. There were conversations with Carter where I had to explain things I was tired of explaining, not because he was unwilling to understand, but because the distance between our experiences was real, and closing it took work. There were nights I lay awake and asked myself whether I was being brave or just reckless. But then I would think about the way Carter showed up at that gallery. The way he sat with my mother for 3 hours on her porch in Atlanta and listened to her the way I'd watched him listen to me, fully, quietly, like she was saying something worth hearing. The way she touched his arm when she said goodbye, and how that small gesture undid me completely. I would think about the morning I watched him try to cook breakfast and fail so completely that I had to take over, and we stood in his kitchen together laughing until we couldn't breathe, and I thought, this right here, this is what I almost walked away from. He defended me once in front of his family. A comment was made, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of thing that's designed to be deniable. Carter didn't make a scene. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the person who said it and said, "That's not something we're going to do," and moved on. Calm. Final. He held my hand the whole drive home and didn't ask me if I was okay, because he already knew. And because he knew that what I needed wasn't a question. It was exactly what he had already done. I think that was the moment I stopped being surprised by him. I think that was the moment I accepted that Carter Whitfield was exactly who he appeared to be, not perfect, not easy, not without his damage, but honest. Steady. Genuinely, quietly good. He proposed in the penthouse. Not in a restaurant, not with an audience, not with anything performative. He had redesigned one of the small rooms himself, badly, lovingly, using everything I had taught him and executing exactly none of it correctly. The proportions were off. The colors clashed. He had hung something on the wall that I cannot describe without laughing even now. It was the most beautiful room I had ever been in. He stood in the middle of it and said, "I know it's wrong. I know you're going to fix all of this, but I wanted you to see that I was paying attention, that all of it mattered to me, that you mattered to me, and I'd like to spend the rest of my life being worth the effort it takes to know you." I said yes before he even finished the sentence. Our wedding was not small and perfect. It was two families who had nothing in common except the two of us, sitting in the same room, figuring out how to be kind to each other. It was my mother in the front row crying from the moment the music started. It was Carter's hands shaking when I walked in, this composed and careful man, trembling because I was walking toward him. It was me laughing during the vows because I was too full to cry and I didn't know what else to do with all of it. And it was that moment I told you about at the beginning, standing there in that $12,000 gown, next to a man I hadn't known a year before, saying the truest thing I had ever said. I meant every word. I think about who I was before Carter, and I don't regret her. She was careful because she'd earned the right to be careful. She had walls because she'd built them out of experience and love and self-preservation. She was not wrong to protect herself. But she almost missed this. And that is the thing I carry with me now, not as fear, not as a lesson I recite, but as something I feel in my body when I look at my life. How close I came to closing the door before he could walk through it. How many stories I had already written about who he was, who we could be, what was and wasn't possible for a woman like me. How certain I was that I already knew the ending. Love, the real kind, the kind that costs you something, it doesn't come with a familiar face. It doesn't look the way you planned. It doesn't fit the story you rehearsed. It asks you to lay down every conclusion you came to before you had all the information. It asks you to stay in the room when every instinct says leave. It asks you to trust yourself in a brand new way. Carter wasn't my plan. He was never supposed to be my story. He was just a client with a binder and a cold apartment and a loneliness he didn't know how to name. And now he is my home. I think that is the most extraordinary thing I have ever built. If this story moved you at all, if it made you feel something you needed to feel today, please share it with someone. And if you're still waiting for your love that wasn't supposed to happen, I want you to hear this. Keep the door open. Be careful, yes. Be wise, yes. But leave the door open. You never know who's about to walk through it.